There's almost no example in medicine or health where the same thing helps everybody. Subjective quality of life, subjective health is one of the best predictors of long-term health, right? How do I feel? Just asking yourself that question over time as you make changes, being mindful of, how is my body responding, I think is going to get you a good chunk of the way. And often athletes, we say that they're fit, but they're not necessarily healthy. They've kind of often crushed themselves in this attritional training and eating model that is often used, particularly in endurance sports. And then how do you unpick some of that and make it so that people can perform well, long into later life? That was something that we're doing. So alongside my formal academic career, which is largely based in neonatal neuroscience, so I research ways to heal the injured newborn brain. Is my day job, is what I spend most of my time doing. There's been this kind of, working with these other diverse populations and trying to really understand how their environment contributes to health or any kind of disease that they might have.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Tommy. And you mentioned something there that was really interesting. These people can be fit, but not healthy. Now, to most people listening, I would imagine there's a bit of a clash there. What do you mean they can be fit and not healthy? Because I think in society, the prevailing narrative is that the fitter you become, the healthier you become. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, I think from a general population standpoint, there's almost a linear relationship between how fit you are and how healthy you are. And that means that anybody, regardless of their current fitness levels, can probably, again, in the average population, improve that somewhat and have some kind of overall health benefit. However, when you're at the pointy edge of the spear, you have to start making sacrifices for your health in order to get some kind of increase in performance. And that may be because you're targeting a very specific adaptation. If you took a Tour de France cyclist, they're essentially this incredible cardiovascular system on little legs. But if you ask them to jump onto a high wall, they wouldn't be able to do it. They don't have the muscle fibers and the structure to be able to do it. And when you think about what you might want to do long term to protect your health as you get older, one of the most important things is being able to stop yourself from falling over. And that requires a certain type of what we call fast twitch muscle fibers, which you can lose with a huge amount of endurance exercise. So in the long term, while these people are incredibly fit, they may not have the best overall muscle structure and strengths to then be able to keep themselves from, say, falling over in 40 years' time. And of course, there's plenty of time in between those two periods for that to change. But there are lots of things that we need in order to be fit and healthy and just work well in our environment. And in terms of strength or cardiovascular fitness, it's not that much. We do need some, absolutely, but it's not necessarily as much, or we don't have to work as hard as some people tell us, or you have made us believe that we have to, right? To be fit, you don't have to go and run for an hour a day, for instance, far from it. But you do need enough. And if you have enough, then there's a huge amount of health benefit that comes from that. But if you really try and chase a certain adaptation, a certain performance in a given sport, more likely than not, you're going to have to sacrifice somewhere else, which may then be detrimental long term.
Yeah, really, really interesting, and it's something I've been thinking about actually, because I am currently on paper down to do the London Marathon in October of this year. Now, long story how that started. It was a dare from Chris Evans on live radio last January, which I said yes to. And at that point, there was, I think, 12 or 13 weeks to go. Then the pandemic happens, things getting postponed, and as things stand, it's meant to happen in October. Now, I have an amazing running coach who, frankly, saying running coach is really underserving what she does, but she's really big on recovery. And as when I go into sort of intense weeks and I try and experiment with certain things, I'm really looking at my whole load in my life and going, okay, if I'm going to do that, I can't just keep killing it at everything else as well. I've got to make sure that I'm balancing things. So I'm really I think maybe this comes with age, and maybe this is because I'm, a father now and I've got other responsibilities. But I really feel that actually I've got to be very careful about how much I take on here and what I can actually balance, because recovery, rest, recuperation, my cognitive capacity for my job, all those things are sort of vying for that same amount of energy, right?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that come out of that, and it's important to remember that one of the most important things that I've really focused on recently is that humans are far stronger and more resilient than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And often we talk about things that affect our health or can affect our health with this very negative language, which I think has a significant effect on our physiology because of the way that our brains affect our bodies. And part of that, the reason why I bring this up now, is because some stress, and I mean stress is in anything that sort of like directly causes a change in our physiology, is really important for us. It's how we adapt. It's how we get stronger. It's how that we sort of create fitness to survive. But at some point, all of those things start to come together, and they can create too much of what some people might call an allostatic load, like how much total stress is being put into the system. And it can come from all these different places. It can come from the amount that you're sleeping, how well you're eating, the amount of exercise you're doing, psychological stresses, because you've got to go to work, and you've got to balance your patient load, and then you've got to record your 2 hours for Radio 2, and then you've got to think about getting up early to go and do your marathon training, and all of this has an effect. So some small pieces of these stresses, as I would call them, are really important. But overall, you do have to balance them and then give yourself time to recover. And again, if we take the example of an athlete, you don't get stronger through training, you get stronger through recovery. And so continuously beating yourself down in any of those spheres without any ability to adapt or consolidate or recover, then essentially just results in sort of a long-term detriment.
Yeah, I love that. And Helen, who's sort of I went to because I was, having some issues with my right hamstring, and she very holistically looks at the whole body, biomechanics, but also, emotional load and how you think about running. And she, like you, I think also very much we are strong. We are much more capable than we often give ourselves credit for. And she has this she does these little 3-week builds and 1 week rest weeks, but she doesn't call them rest. She says those 1 weeks where you're not actually running and you're walking, that is training. That is your body recovering and building and getting stronger. And she's really hammering that home to me. I think, to be fair, I sort of get that concept. But she says most of the athletes she works with have real difficulty acknowledging that a week of maybe taking it lighter is also going to have a benefit. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of when, so my first year as a junior doctor, I worked in orthopedics in foot and ankle. And one of the consultants, I remember, said that so runners, it's very common for runners to get stress fractures in their metatarsals, in the bones in their feet. And he made the comment that only amateurs get stress fractures because they always want to push themselves. They never want to recover. They never auto-regulate. They never listen to their body. They just think, I need to go out and I need to train really hard because then I'm going to get really fit, and then that's going to give me my fast 5K time or 10K time. Whereas most professional athletes, when your body is what pays the bills, you have to you really focus on recovery and making sure that you're getting stronger and you're not overdoing it. And I think the majority of the athletes that I've worked with are just passionate amateurs, even though I have worked with some professionals in different sports. But those people, they tend to always want to work really hard. And we can go into various reasons why that might be, but eventually it starts to sort of come apart, and it can affect all kinds of things. Like it can affect relationships and your work, because you're constantly trying to fit in 20 hours of training a week,
Yeah.
or racing an Ironman every two or three months, and the travel and time involved in that. And so that's actually one of the most important things. Again, I remember seeing an intake form for an Ironman triathlete for this coaching service that I was running, and looking at the training load and looking at the racing load. Like, the first thing that I thought was, all this is going to result in is divorce, because like it's just not sustainable from a relationship standpoint. So all of the, your body can obviously suffer, but then so can all these other areas if you don't, provide time for sort of relaxation and recovery and all these other things that are also very important.
Yeah, it's interesting how I'm thinking about this, because last January, right at the start of January in 2020, when Chris asked me, I said yes. And that was kind of like the old Rongan from like uni. Like, he'll always say yes, whatever challenge you give me, I will do it. And I was thinking, oh man, that's in 12 weeks. I'm not a runner. Like, that's a long distance to do. And, I would have done it. I know I could have done it, and I would have pushed myself to do it, but I think it would have come at a cost. Now, because of circumstances, that never happened. And it really helped me, though, because now I've really processed what it is about that I liked. I like the thought of doing a marathon. But now I've got really clear in my goals, Tommy. For me, it's about having fun, right? It's about enjoying the process of training. It's about it not breaking me. So I have no desire for a particular time. I really don't have a time in mind. My goal is to be able to function in my life as a doctor, as a father, as a husband, as a health communicator, to enjoy the process and not to break myself doing it. And I believe it's possible, but I believe it's possible if you have clarity into what your goal is, rather than trying to excel and get better at every single component of your life, because that may work in your 20s, but maybe now that I'm in my early 40s, maybe that's not going to work so well.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly appreciate the need for a challenge, and I think again, I think it's important. It's a new skill. It's a new process of bringing things in. It's a new exposure for the body, which has a huge amount of benefit. And I have done my fair share of ridiculous sporting events, essentially for the same reason. And although when I was younger and probably mixed with a small amount of self-loathing in there. But what's interesting to me now, sort of looking back on all of that, is how sort of the marathon has become the pinnacle of challenges for humans. And like the triathlon was kind of in there a little bit, but it's really the marathon. And now, if I think about what is it that I want to be good at physically as I get older, I would have much more, right? Some cardiovascular fitness is incredibly important, like we talked about. But I think physical strength is really undervalued, and probably because we think about these incredible feats of endurance performance like the marathon. But as soon as you think about being strong, you imagine seeing people who are incredibly big and bulky, and maybe you think about taking steroids to achieve that. And again, it doesn't require much, but there's a huge amount of benefit, and not just preventing you from falling and breaking a hip. Being able to do all your daily activities well into your 80s, 90s, 100 plus is going to require some kind of physical strength. So that's where I focused my attention later in life. But I did, I spent 15, 20 years incredibly focused on endurance performance first, and then kind of just sort of switched into something that I think is going to be more, I guess, sort of all round beneficial longer term. And I'm not built like a marathon runner, and let's be honest, you're not really either. And so I certainly appreciate the challenge, but I think longer term, I focused more on gentler aerobic stuff and then strength, because I think that's what's going to take me further into the future.
Yeah, I think you've raised a great point there. I'm doing it because it's trying something new. I would like to have completed that. I'm very lucky to have a place in the London Marathon. So I think, I'd love to do that. So it would just be a nice personal challenge. But yeah, I'm under no illusion that that's necessarily going to be helping me with my longevity. Now there's quite a few things going on there, Tommy, and it's a nice way to move into the main topic I really want to talk to you today about, which is our brain health. You got a lot of experience. You're doing a lot of research in neonatal brain health. And there's a couple of things we've already touched on in terms of, strength. You've touched on a challenge and trying something new. And these are all things that can actually feed into how healthy our brain is. So I thought we could start off with this line that I've heard you say on a talk on YouTube, which is long-term brain health can be inexpensive and simple to achieve. And I wonder if you could expand on what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And this forms essentially the foundation of my current and hopefully future career. And when I think about building a healthy brain, that's essentially what happens when you're a baby, both in the womb and then afterwards for 2 or 3 decades potentially. Then I think, well, how so what do you need to make a healthy brain in the first place, and then what do you need in order to keep it healthy? And those things are often very similar. They are essentially the same thing. And there's always going to be a huge amount of interest in terms of how do we maintain cognitive function late into life, because age-related dementia and age-related cognitive decline are now the leading cause of death. Some people call it Alzheimer's disease, but there's Alzheimer's disease is, as it was originally described, as probably a genetic early onset Alzheimer's disease, familial Alzheimer's disease, whereas what most people have is this late onset Alzheimer's disease, which may actually not be the same thing. And in my mind, it's a continuous onslaught of the brain from the environment, and then a lack of protective factors and a lack of protective inputs. So if you think about things that are protective and beneficial for the brain, so we've talked about exercise. I think the first time, so first in rodents and then in humans, the first time we saw that we can actually increase the size of an important area of the brain later in life was the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is an area of the brain that's very important in memory. It's definitely significantly affected in people with dementia or cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease. And in an older population, I think they were in their 60s, they had them just do brisk walking 3 times a week for a year. I think it was 45 minutes. And there was a control group who did some stretching for the same period of time. And in the brisk walking group, and again, when I talk about cardiovascular exercise, aerobic exercise, that's what I mean. I mean, going for a brisk walk, like it doesn't need to be more intense than that. But that group saw an increase in the size of their hippocampus, which would normally decrease in size with age. And it was the first time that we ever saw in humans, in adult humans, older adult humans, that an area of the brain could increase in size. And so exercise is incredibly important. Again, resistance training has similar effects, but seems to affect more the white matter, which is the part of the brain that's really there for fast connection, sort of connecting all the different parts of the brain and sending signals. And so both aspects, as we might separate them out, aerobic and strength, are important for the brain. And then the challenge aspects, which we talk about, I think this is one of the probably the most I guess forgotten important part of what it takes to make and keep a healthy brain. And again, let's use an athlete analogy, which is that if you stop training, or for some reason you become immobilized, your muscles, and you have a good amount of muscle, you're an athlete, right? Or you say break your leg and it goes in a cast. When you take that cast off, you'll see the leg on that size is smaller. You've lost muscle mass on that size. So anytime you stop sort of giving an input, a stimulus to the muscles, they will reduce in size because it's energetically expensive. If you don't need them, your body isn't going to keep it around. And everything, all the evidence that exists today suggests that the brain is the same, right? Use it or lose it. And when we think about using the brain, again, I like to compare back to what it takes to create and build a brain in the first place. So as an infant, you are doing things like learning to talk, learning social interaction, social cues, learning to control this fabulously complicated meat suit with incredible dexterity. And those things take a huge amount of neurological stimulus, input, and effort. Then throughout life, you start to do things that you may think are hard, but compared to that, really not that hard, like biochemistry as an undergrad, or learning to drive a car, or the ins and outs of your job, right? They feel hard, but in terms of the stimulus and the effort required from your nervous system, it's actually quite small compared to, say, learning how to control your whole body. And as we get older, we just do the same things again and again. They get easier for us. They just become habits. They become patterns, which don't require, again, any significant cognitive input. And because of that, you're essentially telling your brain, hey, I don't need you to be as complex as you once were because we're not doing anything difficult. And you see multiple different strands that kind of come into this. So people have probably heard about the knowledge, right? London cab drivers. Less so now if Uber's continues to be allowed to exist. But to be a black cab driver in London, you had to learn the knowledge originally, which is all of the streets in a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross. And they once looked at brain scans of people taking the knowledge or learning it before and after, and those who passed. And again, we don't know why they passed, whether it was because they were the ones who actually studied, or they have some other skills that allowed them to be able to gain the knowledge. Those who passed, again, saw an increase in size in certain aspects of the brain on a brain scan, and those who didn't pass the knowledge, didn't become cab drivers, didn't. So you've created this incredibly difficult stimulus, which has then helped improve the brain. And you see something similar in terms of people who retire earlier tend to die earlier as well. And that's after you adjusting for all the things that might cause you to retire earlier, such as medical conditions. So again, like telling the brain that it's required, it is incredibly powerful for brain health. And we could go on. So if you look at the brain health or the brain age of musicians, amateur musicians have a better brain age than professional musicians, because amateur musicians, it's harder for them, right? They have to work harder to get a nice result. So all of this is basically telling me that in order to keep your brain healthy, you need to tell your brain that it's needed. And that requires you to do difficult things, which is going to also require you to be bad at stuff as you learn new skills. And then once you've acquired a new skill, you then have to move on to something else. I mean, still do the thing if you enjoy it, but then as soon as something becomes habit, becomes patterned, becomes easy, it's no longer the same stimulus. So this could be anything. It could be dancing. It could be some kind of movement or sport. It could be singing. Teaching others seems to be protective as well. Knitting. I recently started to learn how to code on my computer because that was something that's beneficial for my job, but also incredibly difficult. I'd never done anything like it before. So there are all these things that you can do, but you need some kind of ongoing stimulus to tell your brain that it's still needed, it's still worth keeping around, and that's something that you'll essentially need for as long as you want your brain to still be working.
I mean, it's so fascinating what you mentioned about the leg that goes in a cast, and 6 weeks later, muscle mass has declined. This whole idea that our brain is constantly responding to the inputs that we get, and if we think it's not required, it's like, I'm not going to waste energy shoving it out. I'm going to focus on something else. But it made me think about something Professor Laurie Santos said to me recently on the podcast. She's from Yale. She's a psychology professor and has got this globally successful course called The Science of Wellbeing. And she talks a lot about how our brains kid us often in terms of the things that are going to make us happy are not the sort of things that our brain think is going to make us happy. So we actually behave in a way that actually isn't moving us towards happiness. And as you were talking there, it made me think that it's interesting that society, the way we live now, where everything's front loaded as kids, and then we sort of just gradually decline once we start working. We don't have time anymore to try new things. It's just pay the mortgage, go to work, take the kids to their classes, and then you just, people are waiting for retirement to just chillax. And it reminds me a little bit of that, where as we're older, also we get quite shy. We don't want to suck at something. We don't want to fail at something, so we don't do it. But what you're saying, Tommy, is that actually that's exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be doing things that remind us that, hey, you are needed. My brain is needed. You need to grow. You need to respond. So, yeah, I mean, do you feel we're sort of fighting human nature, or certainly the way society is set up in an effort to improve our brain health?
Yeah, absolutely. The way society is set up is to sort of funnel you continuously in one direction, and then be very good at whatever it is that you do, but it doesn't require, again, it sort of becomes just part of the same thing again and again. It doesn't require the same inputs. And I think there's a huge amount of benefit from being a bit of a jack of all trades, having lots of interests, like diversifying your interests and your expertise and your skills. And that creates some buffer in terms of, hey, you may not always have that job, or you may not always be able to do that job. Having some kind of broader, base of skills or things that you enjoy, again, creates some kind of buffers in there. But equally, as we get older, we're expected to get more serious. Another thing that I didn't mention, which is incredibly important and very well emphasized and advertised by our mutual friend, Daryl Edwards, is play. Yeah. Adults aren't supposed to play. We're supposed to be serious. We're not supposed to have fun. And again, it become, our exercise, our movement is supposed to be very prescribed. It's going to be on a treadmill, or you're going to do X reps in the gym or whatever. And again, that's just not how we're quote unquote designed to move. Like, we're supposed to be interacting with our environment, interacting with other people, animals, nature. That's why our bodies are built and structured the way that they are. But yeah, everything that is required of us in modern day society is sort of pulling us away from those stimuli, those inputs that our body, I think, expects, and then is what creates a foundation for long-term health.
Yeah, and that there's a brilliant talk that you did on brain health that's on YouTube, and I'll definitely link to that in the show notes for this podcast. You put up a graph towards the end, and I think it's something about the amount of cognitive capacity it requires to do certain things, and at one end was learning to walk, I think. At the other end was, retirement and doing Sudoku. And the contrast was really quite stark.
Yeah, and so I borrowed that graph. I remade it. It's made by a friend of mine, Dr. Josh Turkney, who's a neurologist over here in the US, and it's a lot of those ideas about sort of the requirement of long-term stimulus to keep our brains healthy is certainly something that I've discussed a lot with him and gotten from him. And yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to quantify these things, right? Like, how could you possibly quantify the amount of effort that it takes to learn how to control the human body, except for if you think about people, adults who have to relearn how to walk, or if you're trying to build a robot that knows how to walk, right? These are incredibly complex tasks that we haven't even necessarily been able to figure out yet, right? Because it's that difficult. But most of the other things that we require of our brains can probably, as adults, can probably be automated to some degree, because it's actually not that difficult. So yeah, if you think about what you ask of your body and your brain, it's just a steady decline throughout life, and that requires now some kind of significant effort on our part to prevent that.
So in practical terms for people, that could be anything, right? That could be learning a language, learning an instrument, I don't know, doing some balance work, anything, I guess, where you're being challenged is going to have a positive impact on your current brain health, but also, I guess, make you more resilient for that sort of brain decline that we might see as we get older.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, is it can be, almost anything that I say you enjoy, but it's probably, if it's difficult, you're probably not going to enjoy it to begin with, right? This is what we talked about. We don't like being bad at things, and and we're sort of taught to feel like it's not good to be good at something. Whereas actually, if you think about kids, they will just try stuff and they'll be bad at it and they'll fall over and they'll try it again and again and they'll get better over time. And that's, again, something that we need to reacquaint ourselves with. But then, it can and should be something that you enjoy doing, and that you can use. So you learn a language, and then one day we'll be able to travel again, and you can go and put it into practice. But it doesn't need to be a language. It could be anything, any of the things you mentioned, and it could be knitting or whatever. Literally anything that requires you to learn a new skill and that you enjoy. But again, as soon as you get good at it, you have to then start thinking, what can I do next that sort of keeps the challenge going.
Yeah, there's this kind of conflict between mastery and super specialism with that kind of just general broad all-round knowledge, as you say, jack of all trades. And you train as a medical doctor. I really do feel that, of course, specialism is important in medicine, but I think we really have undervalued the role of the generalist for many years. And although not directly related to brain health, I can't help but see some similarities in terms of what you're talking about and how we kind of need that overview. I feel in medicine, Tommy, that now we need generalism more than ever. We've got all these complex problems that are coming across multiple systems in the body, and we can't just be focused on one organ. We have to be able to put everything together.
Yeah, I agree. And when you think about people's health, I think the more that we learn, the more we realize how complex it is, how many different inputs, environmental factors are contributing to this disease or these symptoms in an individual patient. And if you're very hyper-focused on one system or one disease process, you're going to miss out on all the factors that are sort of coming together in this individual. So I think having a really broad-based and open mind is really important when you're then trying to improve the health of a patient, because like the people can come in with the same disease, the same concern, the same symptoms, and there could be vastly different underlying reasons, environmental, sociological, socioeconomic factors that could be contributing. And you really need to be able to appreciate all of those to get the best outcome.
Well, I think that sort of approach applies to us looking after our own health as well, doesn't it? Instead of a laser-like focus on just one area. And, we've both been in the nutrition space for quite a number of years, and there can be a real focus on nutrition. And of course, that's important. But there was, I think, for a period of time, a neglect of the importance of stress management, the importance of sleep. I mean, those things are starting to change. And if we sort of think about brain health and how you think about it with your expertise, you mentioned some of the components of movement that can be really important. And I mean, before we move on from movements, just to be really clear for people, you were saying in that trial, I think, that it was 40 minutes of walking, of brisk walking 3 times a week, changed the size of your hippocampus, one of the memory centers in the brain. I mean, that's not that much, is it?
No, absolutely not. And again, I think it comes from the way I believe society has sort of created this image of exercise where, again, the pinnacle is the marathon. And then to be fit requires this huge volume of running so that you could even survive a marathon. But when we look at this is in terms of the brain, but also in terms of just overall mortality risk, how long you live a healthy life, health span. You get to a point where you reach diminishing returns, we might call it. So if you do a load more, you're not going to get that much more benefit. And that point is something like 30 to 45 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity every day. And when I say moderate to vigorous, I mean a brisk walk. 30 minutes of brisk walking a day is going to get you the vast majority of the way in terms of exercise that's required to see long-term health benefit. And if you do a load more, you're not going to see that much more. So it's really not that much.
It's not that much, and I really think this is a point that's worth hammering home. And yeah, if we move on to nutrition, Tommy, in terms of what kind of things we should be eating to build a healthy brain, I'd be interested in your view there. And also, I wonder if you could touch upon why a healthy brain is important, because we want to build a healthy brain, and then often we think about the other extreme, which is when our brain doesn't work when we're 70, or it doesn't work as well. But we forget that there's this long latent period where our brain function can start to decline before we even get symptoms. So just a couple of things there, which I wonder if you could just sort of expand upon.
Yeah, sure. So actually, before we get into that, you mentioned earlier about this hyper focus on nutrition in terms of what's essential for long-term health. And when I think about the things that a healthy body, a healthy brain requires long-term, right? So nutrition is important, but so is sleep or circadian rhythm, right? Light when it's light, dark when it's dark, movement, some kind of stress mitigation, and then social connection. Probably those are the things that I think are going to underpin most of the stuff. Those are the biggest rocks that that you can move to improve long-term health. I think that the more you neglect any one of those areas, the more you have to become hyper-focused in another. So when people are talking about restricting from a dietary sense, and that could be total calories, it could be fat, it could be carbohydrates, it could be protein, all of them have been vilified by different groups for essentially the same reasons. I think that the reason why we had to become so hyper-focused and so restrictive to a large degree, and actually any one of those approaches can have benefit depending on the person in front of you. It's because we were neglecting the other things. We're neglecting movement. We're neglecting sleep and circadian rhythm. We're neglecting social interaction, social connection. And so that's one reason. It's also something that's very easy to sort of like quantify. Whereas it's hard for me to say, it's easy for me to say, oh, you should stop eating carbohydrates. It's much harder for me to say, oh, you should go and make new friends, right? That's much harder. And so I think that's one reason why we're hyper focused. So the more you neglect the others, then you have to sort of like really sort of focus in on another one, because those other systems are not getting the attention that they should. In terms of building a healthy brain, I mean, the easiest way to think of it in my mind is, well, what is a brain made up of? And it's mainly made up of fat and cholesterol. And that in our modern nutrition environment sounds very scary. I'm not telling you that you need to eat a whole load of fat and cholesterol. Actually, your brain makes its own cholesterol, and it makes it from precursors that could be glucose or could be ketone bodies. When you're a baby, ketone bodies are essentially the preferred precursor for making new fats, making new cholesterol. But one of the things that's very important is DHA, the long chain omega-3 fatty acid that you get in seafood. And there's going to be some variation in terms of what amount people need. And it's probably going to be based on their ancestral background. So there's some evidence to suggest that people who are of a more northern ancestry, so people like me, we got most of our long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids from seafood. So I'm probably going to do better with more, direct from the source. Whereas people who live close to the equator may have gotten more sort of precursors like alpha linolenic acid, which is the omega-3 that you might get in nuts and seeds, and then we make our own DHA. And there's a whole host of other things that can influence that, but there is going to be some sort of individual variation. It's just the point that I'm trying to make. But DHA is incredibly important, and it's accumulated very actively in the brain in the last trimester of pregnancy. So the last 3 months or so. And it's basically being actively, depending on the amount in the mother, it's being actively regulated how much is passed on to the baby. And then basically all of it is ending up in the brain. And then some is put in the fat stores. And humans are the only primate that has significant fat stores when it's born. And that's largely because it's a repository of these important things to then support the brain. And again, because babies are born with an incredibly demanding brain, human babies, and it's, we need these fat stores to support it. It's one of the reasons that we have the brains that we do. So DHA is incredibly important. Lots of other things, will come up. So things like choline can be very important. Again, you might get that from eggs, liver, organ meats, potentially. And then when I think long-term, something that is probably having a negative effect on the brain is really large swings in blood sugar. And there's a lot of data to support that. If you're eating foods that cause very, very big spikes in blood sugar, that's probably over time going to have a negative effect on your cognition. And there are some studies that suggest that in people with diabetes, if you improve their blood sugar control, you improve their cognitive function. And this can happen over years, and again, we're normally told that it's like this inexorable decline over time, whereas actually we have plenty of evidence that suggests that we can reverse that as long as we improve some of these factors. So it's just, I think it's very positive and empowering to say, wherever you are today, there is potential for improvement if you're, sort of capable and able and interested in doing that.
There's a few different threads there. So you mentioned DHA, you mentioned that potentially your ancestry may influence what you thrive best on. So you were talking about yourself and how your ancestors probably got a lot of seafoods. And then you mentioned people who might, like my own ancestry would have been, from India, sort of near the equator. And potentially we can actually make that DHA that typically you would get from seafoods. We might be able to make that from non-animal sources.
Yeah.
It's interesting that my ancestors potentially did that, but then my parents emigrated to the UK. I've been born and brought up here. So my microbiome, I'm sure, has changed significantly to adapt to my new environment. So there's a whole world of complexity here to try and unpick as to what someone like me should potentially do then. Is it more to suit the local environment where I live? Is it more to do with how my ancestors lived? But then I think the wider point for me is there is this big sort of debate, isn't there? DHA important for the brain. So typically you get that from seafood and animal products. And then people who prefer plant-based diets are saying, well, you can take ALA or we can supplement to make that. And I think the truth is that different people probably do well on different approaches depending on all kinds of different factors. But how would you unpick your way through that?
I think where we are currently, it's very difficult for me to say, because of your ancestry, because of what generation of immigrant you are to your current place, to then say this is how you should or shouldn't eat. I believe we'll get to a point where we can do that. I believe very strongly that you can't use genetic testing to tell you what you should eat. Most of that is complete nonsense. And so this is kind of in that box. So when I'm talking about, particularly polyunsaturated fatty acids, there have been studies where they look at whether populations based on their ancestry do better with plant or animal-based sources of PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3s and omega-6s. And so in broad strokes, I can tell you that people of your ancestry will probably do better or are more likely to thrive using plant-based sources than mine. But that doesn't mean that you will do better on plant-based sources than I will, or vice versa. So I think a lot of the confusion, and this can come from pretty much any area in health, the confusion comes from conflating what can we say on a population level versus what can I recommend the individual. And they are very, very regularly not, they are essentially mutually exclusive. I can't take anything from a population level and say this will definitely help this individual. Now, both are important because you may want to identify groups at risk for certain conditions. And then, all of medicine is applying statistics and hoping that you're going to improve an outcome, right? So when you do a clinical trial, you see, you give half the group an active drug, you give half group placebo, you generate something called the number needed to treat. How many people do you need to treat so that one will benefit? And often that number is quite high, right? So you're treating a lot of people so that one will get benefit on average, right? So there's almost no example in medicine or health where the same thing helps everybody. So all we're doing is playing the statistics, and this is just unfortunately how we have to work currently, and things will improve over time. So for fats, I think it's very difficult. We'll get to a point where we can measure some of these things, but if I measure the omega-3s and omega-6s in your blood, it's a very, very poor indicator of what's in your brain, because there are transporters, other mechanisms that are regulating that. So some people would say, well, you just measure the omega-3s in the blood, that will tell you something about the brain. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But again, these things will improve. However, one area where we have made some improvement is in blood sugar control. And there have been some really interesting studies, first from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, then Tim Spector's group in London have done some similar work. And basically looking at, based on an individual food, a person, when they're eating it, what the sort of the context of that food is. Have they exercised recently? Is it breakfast? Is it lunch? Is it dinner? Their genetics, their microbiota, all these, their metabolic health in general, what their fasting blood sugar is. Then there's a huge amount of variability in how different people respond to the same food. So if I eat a banana, I'll have a very different blood sugar response to when you eat a banana, and all of those factors are going to play a role there. So I think we can, to a certain extent, that we're starting to get to a point where we'd hope to be able to predict it, right? So maybe I can measure some things in you, and then I'll say, well, this is how you're going to respond to banana, this is how you're going to respond to pasta, this is how you'll respond to a cookie. But we can also do it ourselves to a certain extent. So we can, there's increasing interest in continuous blood sugar monitoring, or just testing your blood sugar after meals, see how you respond. And again, this is not something that I'm not saying everybody needs to do it. I'm just saying this is probably the area where we're the closest to being able to understand into individual variability. And even then, it's quite an intensive process, and that's just with blood sugar. So then when you think about all the different fats, all the different micronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, we're really miles away from being able to understand how one person should eat for their individual health. So then it really comes down to personal preference to a large extent, and then some kind of iterative process whereby maybe you do some blood tests, or maybe you just how do I feel, right? Subjective quality of life, subjective health is one of the best predictors of long-term health. And so we, at the moment, we just have to be guided by some of that, because the rest, people are working on it, but it's incredibly complex and we're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, that question, how do I feel? So powerful, but just hardly ever spoken about. It's about, like I say, on this podcast, this is about helping people become the architects of their own health, which is the place I want to put them into, where they feel, yeah, I can absorb this information from the experts, or from people who've got experience in a certain area, but then I can start to put it through my own filter and go, well, does this work for me? Does it work in the way I live my life, with my family, with my work patterns. Um, and I think we've forgotten a bit of that. I don't know, that autonomy, that sort of sovereignty that actually sometimes we know what's best for our bodies, not somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there has to be more humility in people who talk about any given approach to improve health, because if you actually go out in the real world and apply it, you're going to see it fail
Yeah.
a lot. And again, that's not, I don't think that's a depressing message. I think it's just a reminder that humans are incredibly complex. And we essentially are the species that we are because we can thrive in almost any environment, right? There is no other multicellular organism that can thrive in the variety of environments and with the variety of exposures that we can. And so all of those things are going to change what is going to be best for an individual. So when you see any given approach fail, you then have to step back and say, well, hey, this is a useful tool. It's going to work for some people. Or this is a useful tool for some people, but it didn't work for me, and that's fine, right? There's no arguments to be made there. And like you said, the question, like, how do I feel? How do I view my health? Even 30 years ago, a question of somebody's subjective health, how do you rate your health, was one of the best predictors of longevity and mortality. Right, on a scale of 1 to 4, very good, not very good, or poor, something like that. And so just asking yourself that question over time, as you make changes, being mindful of, how is my body responding? Am I moodier? Do I feel less good when I go for my walk? Do I feel less able to concentrate? These can be really good indicators. But again, becoming really hyper focused on something does have its detriments, but looking inwards and just checking in on yourself, how do I feel after I've made this change? Is it positive or negative? I think is going to get you a good chunk of the way.
Yeah. Back to brain health. We were touching on DHA, we were talking about ancestry, and just to sort of complete that then, you're saying that DHA, the fat, is an important component for brain health in the womb when you're growing, but also throughout life? And if so, what are those sources and how can we think about taking practical steps on that?
Yes, so particularly important in the womb, or potentially if you're born prematurely, which is a group that I frequently work with, then making sure they're getting that during that period when they would have otherwise been in the womb, and then throughout life as well. And so your fat tissue is incredibly important. And one of the reasons why it's incredibly important is because it acts as a store for DHA. So some people estimate that the average person has maybe 10 years worth of DHA for their brain stored in their adipose tissue. So that means in their fat tissue. So that means that you don't need to have it every day. You don't need to be overly worried about how much you're taking in because you have a buffer. That's one of the best ways to describe your fat tissue, is an incredibly important buffer. But if you were to take in no DHA and you're somebody who isn't very good at converting it from plant-based sources, or you're not getting plant-based sources because you eat a highly refined modern diet, then there is you're going to run out of that store eventually. And so I'm a big fan of seafood, small fish. If we think about, there is a risk of mercury contamination, some other things in larger, tuna and swordfish and other things. So sardines, particularly good, shellfish, oysters. You can take, there are algal sources, krill sources you can take as a supplement. Like if you're taking it as a supplement, 1 or 2 grams a day is probably going to be enough for most people. If you're eating it from seafood, a portion once or twice a week is probably going to be enough. So it's not a huge amount, but longer term, I think it's definitely going to have an effect. The other side of that is vegetable oils. And there's if you exist in the nutrition space, there is a huge amount of controversy around vegetable oils. Because some people will say if you replace saturated fat with vegetable oils, your cholesterol will be lower, and that's going to lower your risk of heart disease. Other people will say that vegetable oils are incredibly inflammatory, they're easily oxidized, and then that can then cause issues, including heart disease. And so I think there's a varied amount of evidence in both directions for those, and that's why it's complicated. But for the brain particularly, when we look at both the data that we have from humans, and it mainly comes from autopsies in children, and from animal models, including pigs, which are very similar metabolically in terms of their gut and their brain to humans, you see that if you have a large amount of linoleic acid, which is an omega-6, largely found in vegetable oils in our diet, if you have a large amount of that in the diet, it seems to outcompete DHA getting into the brain. So if we're just thinking about simple heuristics, not eating a lot of fried foods is probably going to be number one for a number of reasons, but that's going to be one because that's makes up a significant portion of the caloric intake or caloric content of fried foods and a lot of processed foods. And then just making sure that you're eating some kind of whole food sources of some omega-3s at the same time. So reducing your intake, just if you're eating whole foods and cooking them at home as much as you can. And again, there's a lot of privilege that's involved in being able to do that. It's not something we've talked about yet, but that's that we have to remember that as well. But if you're reducing the intake of those vegetable oils, again, just from sort of processed and fried foods, then I think most of the problem goes away. So you don't need to be like overly worried or really hyper focused on that. Just removing that component there, and then making sure you're getting some from whole either seafood or plant-based sources. That's probably going to be good enough, right? It doesn't require anything harder than that.
So you're saying that we've got these omega-3s, these DHAs, and we've got these omega-6s, which we were talking about. A lot of them come in the vegetable oils and in highly processed foods and fried foods, and they're sort of competing. So one option is to increase omega-3s, but you're saying actually a really good option that will have multiple benefits is reduce how much processed food you're having, how many vegetable oils are in your diet, and actually automatically that's going to mean ratio-wise there's more omega-3 there, and you're going to get all the knock-on benefits as well beyond just vegetable oils and sort of oxidized vegetable oils that you get from whole food diets. Is that effectively what you're saying there, Tommy?
Yeah, exactly. And depending on the nutrition camp that you're in, people get very hyper focused on a specific intake, a specific ratio. They start looking at the omega-6 and omega-3 contents of all their foods and trying to increase, decrease one and increase another to improve the ratio. I don't think that anybody really needs to do that. I think if we just focus on reducing the most significant contributors, which have a number of potential negative health effects, which are processed and fried foods, and then we are just getting some whole food based sources, if it's fish once a week, or chia seeds in your morning porridge or something, which is a good plant source of ALA, which is a precursor to DHA. Just by doing that is probably gonna get you most of the benefit.
When we do talk about vegetable oils, is it the vegetable oils per se, or is it how they're cooked and if they're fried and if they're heated?
Yeah, I think both is actually important. So the linoleic acid, this main omega-6 in vegetable oils, in its native state seems to and I don't think we necessarily understand exactly how or why, but it seems to compete with DHA getting into the brain. And so, and if you have a huge amount of that as forming part of the fat content of the diet, then you seem to see less DHA in the brain. And that's regardless of how that oil comes. But equally, there's also some increasing literature on the breakdown products where it's become oxidized, which happens with high heat, repeated heating cycles. So if you think about the fryer at McDonald's, it's goes through multiple cycles on and off, being heated and cooled, and that's something that definitely increases the oxidation of the oil. And that seems to have a negative effect on brain health as well. There's some data in humans and then also in animal models. So I think it's a bit of both, really. However, I don't think we should be demonizing these things and just saying they're definitely bad, they shouldn't be in the diet. So, when we talk about vegetable oils, what are we talking about? So I'm talking, sunflower oil, refined rapeseed oil, which again is soybean oil. These are these are the ones used in commercial fryers in, fast food restaurants. Sunflower oil, not as bad actually, because it has a lower linoleic acid content. It's more monounsaturated fats, more like olive oil. So again, olive oil, a very good option. Coconut oil, avocado oil, butter, tallow. If you're a carnivore, you can use the rendered fat from your cow. So when you're cooking with these in normal amounts at home, I don't really think it's worth worrying about. Obviously, if you're deep fat frying at home, the same applies. But if it's just in a pan to saute some vegetables or cook a bit of chicken or something, I'm much less worried about that. I think, again, if we think about the big rocks that you want to move, if you're using a bit of sunflower oil at home to cook yourself a stir fry, rather than getting a big portion of chips that were sort of the total exposure and the nature of it is very, very different. So again, if you can bring it back to cooking whole foods at home, you're able to do that. You have the facilities and the resources to do that. Then I think a lot of the problem goes away.
There's talk that these oxidized fats can stick around in our body for a long period of time. And is that something that we should be thinking about? So, a lot of people like some fries, for example, which of course is likely to have been cooked in multiply reheated vegetable oils, which presumably will be super oxidized and drive inflammation in the body, I would imagine. Crisps are a very common snack here in the UK. I think even people who like to follow whole food diets find it really hard to resist, fries and crisps. And those things, of course, are highly processed. And just in terms of, one thing I love about your approach and why I think I resonate with it so much is because there's real balance there. There's real sort of, it's not about extremes necessarily. It's about saying, look, here are the big levers to turn. Don't worry about these small things if you're turning those big ones. And I just wonder, when it comes to things like fries and crisps, that oxidized fat can stick around, I think, in the body for quite some time. So it's not about demonizing it necessarily, but just helping people understand why they may not be the best choices, certainly in high amounts. I don't want to be too prescriptive, but I think we need to talk about these things.
Yeah, it's a very important question. And I think the natural tendency is for people to basically say they're terrible for your health, you should never eat them. And there's really no evidence to support that idea. Although, like, mechanistically, like you say, biochemically, yes, these things can hang around for a long time. But one of the most important aspects of all of this to me is to control the things that you can control, and then the ones that you can't control or you're not willing to control for whatever reason are things that you shouldn't worry about, right? And because I think that the process of worrying about it is worse than the process of doing the thing itself, right? So if you have a bag of chips once a month because it's your treat on a Friday night, I would much rather you do that and enjoy it, and it's part of your overall health and well-being, than worry about what the fat that's on those chips is going to do in your body. Like, I would really hope that you don't do that, because the effect of worrying is probably going to be more significant than the effect of the fat on the chips. So it's very much about just thinking about what am I trying to achieve? What can I meaningfully control that doesn't have a negative effect, right? Because if you feel like you're being restricted because you can't have your monthly Friday night chips, that's going to have a negative effect on your physiology. And people who feel more restricted dietarily then have some knock-on effects, like they have higher stress hormone levels and things like that. Like, it has an effect on your physiology. So to the extent that you can and are willing to change something, do that. That's great. It's going to have, it's definitely going to have an effect on your health. But when you get to a point where it feels restrictive long term, A, it's not going to be sustainable, and B, it's going to have a negative effect on you. So yes, I think that people should minimize their intake of vegetable oils and fried and processed foods. I still eat those things, and it's a big part of, occasionally, and it's a big part where it's important to me to, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to enjoy it and then not feel guilty about it, because the guilt is going to be worse than the food itself.
That guilt and feeling bad about something is actually a lot more toxic than people really think. And there's actually really good research. Kristin Neff has done a lot of research on self-compassion for 20 years, which I've only been coming across in the last few months. And it's really, really fascinating. And it really echoes my own clinical experience, which is deprivation and restriction works for a period of time. But if you still feel as though you're being deprived and restricted, you can get all kinds of toxic knock-on behaviors on the back of it. You feel bad. As you say, if you're going to have those chips with your friends, if you're going to do it, enjoy it and understand that, hey, you know what? I'm doing this because I'm with my buddies and I'm hanging out and it reminds us of university or whatever it is. Be in that, because otherwise the next morning you wake up, you're like, man, I shouldn't have done that. I'm a failure. I can't stick to anything. You drink more wine that evening to compensate for that feeling. And it's a knock-on effect. And again, this doesn't get spoken about enough, I don't think, in the health and wellness space. It's all very well giving a prescription for healthy living, but how we deliver that prescription, how that prescription is communicated is so important, but I just don't think it's given enough credit.
Yeah, this is, and I particularly got interested in this when thinking about, we talked about genetics briefly, the way we talk about our genetics and our health. And we always talk about it from like using this negative language, right? Either you're normal or you have some kind of genetic risk factor or deficit, or this gene isn't working properly. If you listen to people who talk about genetics and health, that's the language that they use. And so automatically you're creating this negative association with something that's inherent to you, and it has a negative effect on your physiology. So they've done experiments where they had people do a treadmill test, right? How far can you run in 30 minutes? Then they did a genetic test, and they told them, based on your genetics, we would expect you to be, either you have a good aerobic performance gene or you have a bad aerobic performance gene. Then they redid the test. Those who were told that they had a good performance gene did exactly the same. Those who were told they had a bad performance gene did worse on average, right? They've been told they have a bad gene for aerobic performance, and they actually got worse on a treadmill test. Now, the thing is that they randomized people to whether what they told them was true or not. So the effect was not in the genes. The effect was in being told whether you had the gene or not, which actually was not true. So being told something negative about your physiology, about something that's inherent to you, has a negative effect on your health or your performance. And this is how we talk about things. This is how we talk about vegetable oils. This is how we talk about genetics. This is how we talk about carbohydrates or protein or meat. And what it creates is that, like, everything becomes this, well, what's the negative effect this is going to have on me? It's never what's the beneficial, what's the benefit? Like, what are the great things that are happening to me right now because of this? And we know, Ellen Langer has done some incredible work on the effects of the mind on physiology, blood sugar control, weight, like body weight. And we just don't give that enough credit. So the way that health experts talk about these things, you're automatically creating this sort of feeling of negativity around pretty much anything in the people who are listening. And that's having a bigger effect, I believe, on the physiology than actually whatever the advice is.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Tommy. There's so many aspects of that to think about. There's how we communicate health messaging. So we always feel that we're slightly inadequate in some way, that, oh, I need to optimize. I need to, oh, I wasn't born with that gene. Oh, but my best mate, oh man, I've got to do something to compensate for my inadequacy. But that sort of mindset, it sort of goes beyond that as well, doesn't it? That not feeling good enough in ourselves, that insecurity that many of us have. I remember I didn't sort of go down that route at the time. I remember you saying that in your earlier days, you used to go on these quite brutal endurance. You'd really, really push yourself, and you sort of laughed it off at the end of a sentence. There was a bit of self-loathing there, and I really noticed that at the time, because I know myself, one of the reasons I feel I can approach the marathon this year with a real calm is because I'm not trying to prove myself to anyone. I'm comfortable with who I am. I've done a ton of therapy over the last 7-8 years, and I feel I like the person that looks back at me in the mirror now, whether I run a marathon or not, whether I finish it or I fall after 7 miles and I'm injured. That doesn't change how I feel about myself. My kids still love me. My wife still loves me. I still love me. And I know my own behaviors in the past were driven from a place of not feeling good enough. So I would define myself. My identity was made up around, oh, if you do that, yeah, you're a success. You are someone. And letting go of that has just given me more freedom in my personal life, but also with my health, I feel. And I don't know, how would you think about that self-loathing you spoke about before? And how do you think that's impacted your journey throughout health?
Yeah, I think most of my health journey actually started with that. I was bullied a lot as a kid. I was a bit overweight, didn't really like sport, didn't really have very many friends. I was absolutely the nerd who wanted the extra tests, was trying to do very well at school, which doesn't often go down well with your peers. And when I was 18, that essentially manifested itself in a hyper focus on my how I looked physically, because I was dumped just before my A levels, and I channeled all of that into the gym, which is the first time I'd ever really done any significant exercise. And like when you're 18 years old, you're like, well, if I get a 6-pack, maybe she'll love me again and she'll take me back, right? And I think this is where where a lot of teenage males may end up going, and obviously not at all helped by Men's Health and Men's Fitness magazines, which I read obsessively.
Yeah, me too.
And I remember, and I was also very hyper focused on like everything that went into my mouth. It had to be very high quality, it had to be completely unprocessed. I had to have cooked it myself. I had to know all the ingredients. This is sort of, I guess, like 18, 19, mainly in my gap year before university was when it was probably at its worst. And I remember when I then got to university, somebody as a joke posted underneath my my dorm room door a thing about orthorexia, which, this is in 2003, right? I don't think anybody had heard of orthorexia then, right? And like that was really when I was at my lowest. Like I was training 20 plus hours a week. I wasn't really eating very much. I look at pictures back of me, like of me back then. I'm gaunt. Actually, I went to see my grandmother one summer, and she used that word. It was Icelandic, but she basically told me that I was gaunt. And I didn't see it. But like slowly over time, as I became accepted by my peers, as I started to feel like I had worth in other areas, as I like started to be like loved more by others, and I started to love myself and understand myself, a lot of this stuff disappeared. But it's in the background all the time. Like I still think too much about what I eat, and I still think too much about the exercise that I do, but it's sort of just like a little grumble that's in the back of my mind. It's not negatively affecting my health in the way that it used to. But that journey took 15 years, maybe. But because of that, it allows me to see it in others, empathize with it in others, really understand why these things exist, how common it is. And then also, inform some of my approach to how we might think about health and nutrition and stuff. But it's so basically that journey, which has sort of underlied all of my education and professional experiences, has kind of been ongoing and has really sort of laid the foundation of it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tommy. Super poignant to hear that, and certainly helps us understand some of your passion for health messaging and the way we can and should deliver that messaging. Yeah, I think emotional health is so important, isn't it? I mean, is there much research on emotional health and brain health? I certainly know there is regard to overall health and well-being and our satisfaction, but with respect to our brains, is there anything there that you're aware of?
Well, they're very intimately connected. And if you think about anxiety and depression, those who have diagnosed anxiety and depression have an increased risk of dementia. Those who have certain types of stress, emotional stress, so particularly they've looked at this in the workplace. If you have a job that has a high amount of stress, but you have very little control over that, that's then also that obviously has a negative effect on your mental health at the time, but also increases your risk of cognitive decline. So, and these things are intertwined, right? Is it simply the psychological effect, or is it the mind and the body are intimately connected, and we know that a lot of injury processes in the brain have a peripheral component, which could be some kind of inflammation due to some other kind of disease process, which then negatively affects the brain. And these things are in constant communication. So yeah, the things that affect our emotional well-being and our subjective stress levels absolutely then can have an impact in terms of our long-term brain health.
Yeah, I mean, we're all on a journey, aren't we, in our health, whether it's as health communicators or just to improve our own well-being. And I certainly think of the way I've evolved my thinking is, yes, food, movement, sleep, stress, super important, of course. But I really feel these days that how we feel about ourselves, self-worth, that emotional health, I'm starting to think that that's actually more of a root cause, because when that's sorted, you often don't need to chase around with food, movement, sleep, and stress, because actually you don't actually compensate for that lack of self-worth by engaging in those other behaviors. So, I mean, that's currently where my head is at the moment. How do you think about that?
I think, because of all the sort of the reasons we've gone over, I'd completely agree with you. And the modern environment, social media, how we interact with others now, I think feeds into this, general negative self-worth. And again, even those of us who are trying to help other people improve their health, we can absolutely make it worse. And I'm sure we actively do that despite our best interest. And I think most people are trying to help. They just don't realize the potential, negative effects of that. But again, I think these things are tightly connected. So if you put yourself in an environment that is supportive of your self-worth and your mental health, yes, that's going to hopefully reduce these sort of negative behaviors that can have a negative effect. But I think the nature of that environment can also support better habits or better processes in those areas. So, if you're in a place that is actively supporting your self-worth, you're probably going to sleep better. And you're probably, getting either making or sort of being exposed to better food choices and better social connection, and you're less subjectively stressed. And I think if the environment changes, then many of these things are going to change, and these things compound over time. So we know that people who start to exercise more are more likely to change their diet. They're more likely to stop smoking. They're more likely to sleep better. And these things they're intimately connected. So yeah, I mean, the environment that we're creating currently is probably having this huge effect on our self-worth that is then negatively impacting all these other areas. And then it might be from person to person, a different area is the route in. Maybe it's a focus on sleep, which then improves mental health and self-worth, which improves your diet or your movement or whatever.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a different route in for different people. You can enter that circle at any point, and it can start to feed all the other components. To sort of close this off, Tommy, there are two other areas I wanted to talk to you about in relation to brain health was sleep and connection. Now, I'm super cautious, given what we've just said, that we don't stress anyone out as we talk about a lack of sleep and brain health and a lack of connection in brain health. So let's keep that at the top of our minds if we can, which is always difficult. But how did those two things potentially impact our overall brain health?
So sleep has become, thankfully, sexy again, which I think is fabulous, because it really did used to be sort of like society said, sleep when you're dead, get the work done. It's something that you can reduce, and you'll just, don't worry about it, pay for it later. And you really do pay for it pretty much right from the start. So I'm really glad that people are starting to focus on sleep again. And I also think, and this is something that I've learned from my friend, Dr. Greg Potter, who's my own personal expert in circadian biology, and we've published together and worked together on some projects. And he'll tell you that actually we don't sleep as badly as we're told we do. And the majority of people probably sleep enough. But, if you're not spending 7 hours in bed, all things being equal, you're probably going to be better off from a mental health standpoint, a long-term brain health and physical health standpoint, if you do get to spend 7 to 8 hours in bed, and then you get to spend most of that asleep. And we look at both sleep quantity and sleep quality. Both of those are important for long-term risk of cognitive decline. And though it's difficult to really unpick it, we probably can't pharmaceuticalize our way into that. So if you're taking sedatives in order to achieve that sleep, you're probably not going to be getting all of the benefits, because the nature of that sleep isn't the same. So I don't think our sleep is necessarily as bad as we're told it is, but for the people who aren't sleeping well or long, and it doesn't, again, like 7 to 9 hours is probably the average that you might want. Then I think there's definitely going to be some benefit to improving that if you're able to spend that extra time in bed.
There was one paper I think I saw you present once, Tommy, where decreased sleep, yes, increases reactivity in the amygdala, the emotional part of the brain, but also I think you shared something where it decreases empathy, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, so this was those things were actually from the same paper, looking at how we react to visual cues in other people's faces when we're sleep deprived or not. And when we're sleep deprived, and acutely, it's going to happen in one night of sleep. And again, the important thing that other studies have shown that is that one night of bad sleep does not have any meaningful negative effect on your health, right? So, overall, we're talking about these things compounding over time. So if you sleep badly one night, it's not something to worry about. Again, it's just it's fine, and you'll survive just fine. You'll have no long-term negative effects. But when people are sleep deprived, you're less likely to be able to recognize a positive emotion or change in somebody else's face. You're less likely to be able to empathize with them, and you're more likely to see something as negative. And again, so when you think about people sleep deprived in meetings, on Zoom calls, interacting with others, meeting new people, when you're sleep deprived, it's more likely to be a negative experience. And again, I think this stuff compounds over time. So this is one of, if you want to be a well-rounded, socially connected, sociable human being, sleep is incredibly important. And that's in that study, that was one of the reasons why that was found to be the case.
Yeah. I think we all know that intuitively. I mean, going back to how do we feel, we can talk about sleep and ask yourself the question, each morning, how do I feel? Was that enough? Do I feel refreshed? Do I need a little bit more tonight? Was that a little bit later than is best for me? Just finishing off there then, Tommy, on connection. And, I guess some of the softer stuff, or what we used to think was the softer stuff. I don't think I learned anything about the power of connection at medical school now, thinking back. Maybe I did, maybe I've forgotten about it. But just how important is connecting with others for our brain health?
When you really boil it down, social connection, again, is essentially the sort of foundational aspect of us as a species, right? We are a collectivist species. We benefit from being part of a social group, from having a place in that social group, from having a purpose within that group, which gives us meaning. And having meaning is something that tells our body that it's worth being alive. Having meaning or not seems to have an effect on the immune system, has an effect on our physiology. And so without social connection, you're essentially not giving that input, which is that you have purpose, you have meaning, you belong. And that is one of the critical inputs for the brain to keep working. And one of sort of the downstream or threads that comes out of this demand-driven theory of cognitive decline, which we talked about earlier, is the grandmother hypothesis. And so the grandmother hypothesis states that, rather than when you've procreated, you are essentially just a useless sack of meat, which is what some people will tell you about the evolutionary forces on our bodies, right? That you're just there to procreate. Once you've done that, there are no more evolutionary forces that are creating fitness, right? And so, like, most people will say that your genes are just there to make you live to 20 or 30 years old, procreate, and then what happens after that doesn't really matter. However, the grandmother hypothesis would state that if you are useful and healthy longer into life, then you are available to help support your progeny, their progeny, and to keep your tribe alive, right? So you are actually increasing the likelihood that your genes will be passed further into the future by being alive to be able to help the new parents or being able to look after the grandchildren. So actually, there are evolutionary forces that exist to keep us long and healthy for as long as possible. However, you get to a point where you are no longer of use to the group, and then that's probably going to be a trigger for some kind of decline, because as soon as you're no longer of benefit, if we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, we think about hunter-gatherers, early humans. As soon as you're no longer of benefit, you are a detriment to your tribe, to your group. You're going to take up resources. People are going to have to care for you, which they can't really afford to do. So that could trigger this period of decline. You think about wolves or dogs leaving the pack when they're old so they can go and die peacefully in the wilderness. And humans used to do that in some groups as well. So we are only giving ourselves the input that says, you're worth being here, you're worth having some kind of function because you're part of a group and because you have purpose. And without social connection, it's almost impossible to have any kind of significant purpose, because you don't know that you have purpose because you're not contributing to some kind of goal or group that's greater than yourself. So I think that, we've kind of bounced back from the philosophical to the physiological, but at some level, for us to survive and be healthy and functional requires some kind of social input that says you have meaning, you belong, you have purpose. And so that's going to be critical to physical health, mental health, cognitive function. And that requires social connection. It requires other people to help you see and learn that. And so without that social connection, I think that is probably a significant trigger for decline in health and decline in cognitive function.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tommy. Super powerful. And, I was thinking about my elderly mother as you were saying that, and the message was coming through to me that you got to give your brain a reason to think that you need to be alive, you have value. And I think we can all think about that for ourselves and for the people around us. Tommy, I've so enjoyed our conversation today. We've gone into all kinds of different areas. There's so much we didn't touch upon as well, which no doubt we'll do at some point in the future. Tommy, I always love to leave the listeners and the viewers on YouTube with some practical tips. So the podcast is called Feel Better, Live More. When we feel better in ourselves, we get more out of life. You have worked with neonates, you've worked with people trying to lose weight, you've worked with Formula One drivers, with athletes, with all that experience. What are some of your top practical tips for people to improve the way that they feel?
I think when you go across all of those different groups, what I've seen again and again is that the things that are required for optimal performance are the same as the things that are required for optimal physical health, the same as the things that are required for optimal cognitive health and cognitive function. And those are the things that we've talked about. So they are, sleep, diet, nutrition, social connection. And what I think there are two things that are really important to remember from like my perspective. One is that to improve any of those things requires much less physical effort than we are often told, right? Or that we tell ourselves in terms of the amount that we need to change our diet or restrict our diet, or the amount that we need to exercise. And even just small changes, a brisk walk 3 times a week, can have huge knock-on effects on our brain and on our bodies. And so that's one thing. It doesn't take much to have a really big effect. And the other thing is to remember that we are incredibly strong and resilient as individuals, but that does require a group. It does require a collective, because that's where we derive our meaning and purpose, where a lot of this comes from. So, remember that it doesn't take much to improve any of those areas, which will then have knock-on effects in other areas. And then also remember that you are an incredibly strong, resilient human being, with, significant purpose and meaning, and, you are loved and you have a place. And because of that, you have incredible strength. And if you remember that, then all this negative messaging that could come from a lot of it's internal, but a lot of it comes from external social media, all that kind of stuff. Then you can sort of leave some of that by the wayside and just remember like how little it takes to improve and how strong and resilient you really are.
Yeah, brilliant way to finish. Great advice there, Tommy. At the end, I just want to publicly acknowledge you, Tommy. I think what you're doing is great. I love the information you put out. I love the way you do it. You're someone who I regard as inspirational, very influential, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And you're one of very few people in this arena that I really respect and look up to as well. And I really appreciate that.
Cheers, Tommy. Really hope you enjoyed that conversation. Please do think about one thing that you can take and apply into your life. Inspiration is not enough. You need to take action. If you did enjoy that, please do press subscribe, hit that notification bell, and why not check out this conversation that I picked out that acts as the perfect follow-up.